These are the top 10 aces of aces. So let's start by making a distinction between an ace and an ace of aces. An ace is a pilot with 5 kills. An ace of aces is the top pilot among aces during any given conflict. So for instance, Robin Olds had a total of 16 kills in 2 different wars. He had 12 in World War II and 4 in Vietnam. So obviously he was not an ace in Vietnam because he only had 4, which he did on purpose so he wouldn't be sent home for PR purposes. And when he scored 12 in World War II, he was not the top ace in the Army Air Corps. So he never had the title Ace of Aces. Now this list of 10 is ranked according to the Mooch tally, which we know from previous Rack and Stack episodes is a proprietary and scientific algorithm using 4 different variables. And in this case, those variables are number of kills, enduring contribution to air warfare tactics, awards, and things like the Blue Max and the Medal of Honor get pilots the maximum 10 points for that variable. And finally is icon factor, impact on pop culture, etc. Now let's get to the top 10. Coming in at number 10 with a Mooch tally of 27.5 is Adolphe Pegoud. But any discussion of Pegoud starts with Louis Blériot, who developed the first headlamp for cars and established a profitable business manufacturing those headlamps, and he used that money to finance his attempts to build a successful aircraft company. Blériot was the first to use the combination of stick and rudder to control an airplane, which is still used to this day. He was also the first to make a powered monoplane. In 1909, he became world famous for making the first airplane to fly across the English Channel, which won him a prize of 1,000 pounds offered by the Daily Mail newspaper. So as a test pilot for Louis Blériot, Adolphe Pegoud was the first guy to actually bail out of an airplane on purpose, and they sacrificed the airplane when they did this. So as he jumped out of the airplane, he got a good shoot, and he looks over at the airplane he's just jumped out of, and it does a loop. And that's the first time he'd ever seen an airplane do that. So that gave him an idea. So on September 21st of 1913, Pegoud took a Blériot monoplane and performed the first loop. He went on to develop a series of maneuvers using the Blériot, in essence creating the first air show. At the start of World War I, Pegoud volunteered for flying duty, was immediately accepted as an observation pilot. On the 5th of February in 1915, he and his gunner were credited with shooting down 2 German aircraft and forcing another German aircraft to land. Soon he was flying a single-seat airplane, and in April he claimed 2 more victories, which made him the first ace ever. On 31 August 1915, Pegoud was shot down and killed by one of his pre-war German students, Otto Kandulski, while intercepting a German reconnaissance aircraft. Pegoud was 26 years old. Coming in at number 9 with a Mooch tally of 29.9 is Joseph C. McConnell. McConnell entered the U.S. Army Air Force's Aviation Cadet Program in 1943 during World War II, but his dreams of becoming a pilot were dashed when he was sent to navigator training instead of pilot training. He was commissioned as second lieutenant and got his navigator wings on September 18, 1944. He joined the 448th Bomber Group in England in January of 1945 and wound up flying 60 combat missions in Europe as a B-24 Liberator navigator. He remained in the Army Air Forces after the war and entered pilot training in 1946. McConnell finally achieved his goal of becoming a pilot and got his Air Force pilot wings on February 25, 1948. He was assigned to the 39th Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing in Korea in September of 1952. McConnell flew F-86 Sabres, and he nicknamed his plane Beauteous Butch in honor of his wife, Pearl Butch Brown. One of his kills was against a MiG-15 piloted by Soviet ace Semyon Fedorov, in which his Sabre was also badly damaged. The engagement started with the MiG-15 ambushing the Sabre, causing significant damage. McConnell quickly reacted and barrel rolled to the MiG-6 and blasted it out of the sky. He ejected over the Yellow Sea and was rescued within minutes by an American helicopter. Amazingly, the next day he got back in the fight and shot down another MiG. During his last combat mission on the 18th of May in 1953, he destroyed 2 and damaged 1 of 28 MiG-15 type aircraft over North Korea, bringing his total victory count to 16 destroyed plus 5 damaged, and making him America's first triple jet ace. Immediately after his 16th victory, McConnell was sent back to the United States along with Pete Fernandez, who was the top Air Force ace with 14.5 victories of the 4th Interceptor Wing. McConnell met with the President at the White House, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, which is America's second highest decoration for valor. His exploits made him a national hero, and he did what all good American heroes of his day did. He appeared as a contestant on the comedy quiz program You Bet Your Life, starring the legendary Groucho Marx. After the war, McConnell was stationed at George Air Force Base in California, where he was assigned to the 445th Fighter Squadron and continued flying F-86s. In 1954, he was temporarily assigned to the test program for the new F-86H Sabre, which was the last and most powerful version of the airplane and was intended to be a nuclear-capable fighter bomber. On the 25th of August in 1954, while testing the 5th production F-86H at Edwards Air Force Base, McConnell was killed in a crash near the base following a control malfunction. The cause of the accident was determined to be a missing bolt. After his death, a movie called The McConnell Story, which chronicles his life, was released in 1955. The movie stars Alan Ladd and June Allison. Coming in at number 8 with a Mooch tally of 30.1 is Rene Fonck. Fonck started his military pilot career in the spring of 1915 as a 21-year-old flying observation planes. Then in April of 1917, he received the coveted invitation to join the famous Combat Group 12, the world's first fighter wing. Fonck was assigned to the squadron SPA 103, flying the SPAD 7. And he quickly made a name for himself, attaining ace status in less than a month. He became known for his clinical professionalism. He applied mathematical principles to combat flying, and his engineering knowledge regarding the capabilities of the aircraft he flew was unrivaled. He took few chances, patiently stalking his intended victims from higher altitudes. He then used deflection shooting with deadly accuracy at close range, which used little ammunition per kill. More often than not, a single burst of less than 5 rounds from his Vickers machine gun was enough. His preferred method of aerial combat was not to engage in dogfights, but to carry out surgically merciless executions. He was also reputed to be able to get tallies on enemy observation aircraft from long range. Then on the 9th of May in 1917, 2 American guest aviators in the squadron, Edwin C. Parsons and Frank Belisle, who were perturbed by Fonck's lectures on aerial success, bet Fonck a bottle of champagne that one of them would shoot down an enemy plane before Fonck. Bayliss took off in spite of hazy weather that morning and shot down a Halberstadt CL-2. Back at the airfield once Bayliss landed, rather than pay off the bet, Fonck badgered the Americans into changing the terms of the bet so that it went from the first person to shoot down an airplane to whoever shot down the most Germans that day would win. That afternoon, Fonck shot down 3 enemy 2-seat reconnaissance planes. A couple of hours after that, he shot down 3 more. Those kills won him the bet by a large margin. By the time Fonck got his last kill in November of 1918, he'd notched a total of 75 victories. Fonck returned to civilian life after World War I, and his fame as a flying ace and war hero allowed him to be elected to Parliament from 1919 to 1924. Now, during that time, he persuaded Igor Sikorsky to redesign the Sikorsky S-35 for the transatlantic race, also known as the Orteig Prize. On the 21st of September 1926, Fonck crashed on takeoff when the landing gear of his Sikorsky S-35 collapsed, which killed 2 of his 3 crew members. As a side note, Charles Lindbergh won that prize 7 months later in the Spirit of St. Louis and became the first pilot to transit the Atlantic. Fonck eventually returned to military aviation and he rose to be the inspector of French fighter forces from 1937 to 1939. So his interwar contacts with the likes of his former World War I foe, Hermann Goering, caused some complications for him. At first he was shunned by the resistance for being pro-Vichy, and then his loyalties were questioned by the Vichy regime, and he was actually arrested by the Gestapo and put into the Drancy internment camp. After the war, a French police inquiry about his activities with the Vichy regime completely cleared him. In fact, he was given a certificate of resistance, which reads in part, Mr. Fonck, a member of the fighting French forces without uniform, took part in territory occupied by the enemy to glorious fights for the liberation of the nation. Fonck died of a stroke in his Paris apartment at the age of 59. At number 7, with a Mooch tally of 31.9, is Richard Bong. On June 12, 1942, Richard Bong was temporarily grounded for looping the Golden Gate Bridge and flying at low level down Market Street in San Francisco. He was still grounded when the rest of his group was sent without him to England in July of 1942. Bong was then transferred to another unit, the 84th Fighter Squadron of the 78th Fighter Group, and sent to the Southwest Pacific. On September 10, 1942, Bong was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron, which was flying the P-40, based in Darwin, Australia. In November of 1942, while the squadron waited for delivery of the scarce P-38 Lightnings, Bong and other 9th Fighter Squadron pilots were assigned temporarily to fly missions and gain combat experience with the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, based in Port Moresby, New Guinea. And on December 27th, Bong claimed his first aerial victory flying the Warhawk, shooting down a Mitsubishi Zero and a Nakajima Oscar over Buna. For his actions, he was awarded the Silver Star. In January of 1953, Bong rejoined the 9th Fighter Squadron, now equipped with P-38s. And on July 26 of 1943, he claimed 4 Japanese fighter, and for that he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. While he was home in the United States for leave the next November or December, he met Marjorie Vatndal at a Superior State Teachers College homecoming event. Their relationship got serious enough that once he got back to the war in the Southwest Pacific in January of 1944, he named his P-38 Marge and adorned the nose with her photo. On April 12th of 1944, Bong shot down his 26th and 27th Japanese airplanes. After that, he was sent back home, and he was visiting training bases, and he went on a 15-state bond promotion tour. Then he returned to New Guinea in September. He was assigned to the 5th Fighter Command Staff as an advanced gunnery instructor with permission to go on missions but not to seek combat. But he found it anyway, and by December 17th, he'd increased his air-to-air victory total to 40. On the recommendation of General Kinney, who was the Far East Air Force commander, Bong received the Medal of Honor from General Douglas MacArthur in a special ceremony in December of 1944. The following month, General Kinney sent America's Ace of Aces, Bong, home for good. Bong married Marge Vatndal on February 10, 1945. After that, he participated in a bunch of PR activities, including more promotion of war bonds. Then he became a test pilot assigned to Lockheed's plant in Burbank, where he flew the P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter at the Lockheed Air Terminal. On August 6 of 1945, he took off to perform a Shooting Star acceptance flight. It was his 12th flight in the P-80. He had a total of 4 hours and 15 minutes in that model. The plane's primary fuel pump malfunctioned during takeoff, and Bong either forgot to switch to the auxiliary pump or for some reason was unable to do so. He managed to clear away from the aircraft, but he was too low for his parachute to deploy. The plane crashed into a narrow field in North Hollywood. His death was front page news across the country, sharing space with the first news of the bombing of Hiroshima. At the time of his death, Bong was only 24 years old. At number 6, with an MT of 32.5, is Joe Foss. While attending the University of South Dakota, Joe Foss excelled at sports. He was a boxer, a member of the track team, and the second string guard on the football team. After graduation, he served as a private in the South Dakota National Guard, but in 1940, armed with a pilot certificate and a college degree, Foss hitchhiked to Minneapolis to enlist in the Marine Corps Reserves in order to join the Naval Aviation Cadet Program and become a naval aviator. After he earned his wings down in Pensacola, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. He served as a plowback instructor, which we now call a surgrad, at Naval Air Station Pensacola. At the age of 26, he was considered too old to be a fighter pilot, so he was given orders to the School of Photography. His first duty station was with Marine Photographic Squadron 1, stationed at NAS North Island in San Diego, California. Foss hated the photo reconnaissance mission and made repeated requests to get transferred to the fighter program. On his own, he was checked out in a Grumman F-4F Wildcat while still assigned to VMO-1, and he logged over 150 flight hours in June and July of 1942. And that effort got him transferred to Marine Fighter Squadron 121. When he got to VMF 121, he was senior enough to be assigned as the executive officer, the second in command. In October of 1942, VMF 121 pilots and aircraft were sent to Guadalcanal to relieve VMF 223, which had been fighting for control of the air over the island since mid-August of that year. The air group, codenamed Cactus, based at Henderson Field, became known as the Cactus Air Force, and they played a pivotal role in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Foss earned a reputation for aggressive, close-in fighter tactics. He shot down a Japanese Zero on his first combat mission on October 13, 1942. But his Wildcat was shot up as well. And with a dead engine and 3 more zeros on his tail, he landed at full speed with no flaps and minimal control and barely missed a grove of palm trees as he rolled out. On November 7th of 1942, he was hit again and he was forced to ditch his Wildcat at sea. His group soon became known as Foss's Flying Circus. In over 3 months of sustained combat, they shot down 72 Japanese aircraft, and 26 of those were credited to Foss, which made him America's first ace of aces of World War II. Foss returned to the United States in March of 1943, and on May 18th of that year, Foss received the Medal of Honor from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The White House ceremony was featured in Life magazine, with the reluctant Captain Foss appearing on the magazine's cover. And I happen to have a picture of that cover, which was given to me by one of my patrons, and it's actually signed by Joe Foss. So after he's on the Life magazine cover, he returns to the Pacific Theater to lead VMF 115, now flying the F-4U Corsair. It was during this second tour that he met and became friends with fellow Marine fighter ace Marion Carroll, who I actually met when my dad was the assistant naval attaché in Holland in the early 70s. He actually had dinner at our house, and I was a 12-year-old boy who was a huge World War II aviation history buff at that time. My bedroom was full of model airplanes hanging from the ceiling. So to meet Marion Carroll was amazing. And during that tour in 1944, Foss also had the opportunity to meet and fly with his boyhood idol, Charles Lindbergh, who was on assignments touring the South Pacific as an aviation consultant. Foss finished his combat service with 26 kills, one of America's top scoring pilots. So Foss's post-war life was eclectic, to put it mildly. First, he opened Joe Foss Flying Service, charter flying and flight school in Sioux Falls that eventually grew into a 35 aircraft operation. Then he owned and operated a Packard car dealership. He was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the South Dakota Air National Guard and assigned as the commanding officer for the Guard's 175th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. During the unit's formative years, Foss was actively involved in flying with the squadron. He even became a member of their P-51 Mustang air demonstration team. Then during the Korean War, Foss, now a colonel, was called to active duty with the United States Air Force. He relinquished command of the 175th and served as the director of operations and training for the Central Air Defense Command. He eventually reached the rank of brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. And then in 1955, at the age of 39, Joe Foss became South Dakota's youngest governor ever. In 1958, he ran for Congress, but he lost to another wartime pilot hero who flew bombers in World War II, Democrat George McGovern, who later went on to lose his 1972 presidential bid against Richard Nixon. In 1959, Foss became the first commissioner of the newly created American Football League. He oversaw the emergence of the league as the genesis of modern professional football. During his tenure, he helped expand the league and made lucrative television deals, including a 5-year deal worth $10.6 million with ABC, and then another deal for 5 years with NBC for $36 million. After that, he drew on his lifelong love of hunting and the outdoors to host ABC Television's The American Sportsman from 1964 to 1967. Starting in 1988, Foss was elected to 2 consecutive 1-year terms as the president of the National Rifle Association. In later years, he did a lot of speaking for conservative causes and what he considered to be the weakening of Second Amendment rights. He was portrayed on the cover of the January 29, 1990 issue of Time, wearing his trademark Stetson and holding a revolver. Then on January 11, 2002, Foss, who was then 86, made the news after he was detained by security at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. He was on his way to deliver an address at the NRA and then speak to a class at West Point. And as he was trying to clear security, and he had to go through a pat-down because he couldn't do metal detectors because he had a pacemaker, this TSA agent found his Medal of Honor and another bullet-shaped memento that they confiscated. That incident was publicized and caused a furor nationwide. And Foss was quoted as saying, "I wasn't upset for me, I was upset for the Medal of Honor, that they didn't just know what it even was. It represents all the guys who lost their lives, the guys who never came back. Everyone who puts their life on the line for the country. You're supposed to know what the Medal of Honor is." Foss suffered a stroke in October of 2002 caused by a cerebral aneurysm. He died 3 months later, New Year's Day, 2003. Joe Foss is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Coming in at number 5 with a Mooch tally of 32.9 is Max Immelmann. When World War I started, Immelmann was sent for pilot training and then stationed in northern France. He saw his first combat while flying the LVG two-seaters, but didn't score any kills. Then on June 3, 1915, he was shot down by a French pilot, but managed to land safely behind German lines. He was decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class for preserving his aircraft. Flying the Eindecker and armed with the synchronized Spandau machine gun, he got his first confirmed kill on the 1st of August in 1915. In this engagement, his first move was to dive on the opponent and wait until he was danger close to fire. But his machine gun jammed after about 60 rounds, and in order to clear it, he needed both hands, which forced him to control the stick with his knees as he merged with the bandit the first time. The British pilot was Lieutenant William Reed, and Reed fought back hard with what little he had. His gun wasn't working, so he flew flying with his left hand and firing a pistol at Immelmann with his right. But Immelmann's 450 bullets fired at him took their effect. Reed suffered 4 wounds in his left arm, his airplane's engine quit, and he had to crash land. Immelmann was unarmed as he landed nearby and walked up to Reed's crashed airplane. They shook hands, and Immelmann said to him, "You are my prisoner," and he pulled Reed out of the wreckage and rendered first aid. This was air war in a seemingly more elegant time. After that, Immelmann quickly built an impressive score of victories, ultimately credited with 16 kills. His signature move was a nose-high maneuver where he'd bleed off airspeed almost to stall and then boot the rudder to pirouette behind the bandit, which became known as an Immelmann. Actually, the original Immelmann was more like what we'd call a wing-over today. The move now known as an Immelmann is a low-to-high maneuver in the pure vertical. On June 18, 1916, Immelmann flying a Fokker E-3 came across another British bandit. Immediately he got off a burst which hit the pilot of the FE-2B pusher, mortally wounding him. Right after that, Immelmann closed on a second aircraft piloted by Second Lieutenant G.R. McCubbin. And as he did this, his propeller came apart, either because it was hit by an enemy bullet or his gun synchronization failed. The resultant vibration of the engine at full throttle spinning half the propeller caused Immelmann's airplane to break apart. At 4,000 feet, the tail and wings broke off from the rest of the Fokker, and what remained of the fuselage fell straight down. Immelmann's body was recovered by German troops from the twisted wreckage, lying lifeless over what was left of his surprisingly intact engine. His body was identified by the initials embroidered on his handkerchief. He was only 25 years old when he died. He was given a state funeral and buried in his hometown of Dresden. All right, coming in at number 4 with a Mooch tally of 33.3 is Oswald Boelcke. Boelcke fulfilled his childhood dream of a military career by joining the Imperial German Army in July of 1912. He followed his interest in aviation, learning to fly as World War I began. Started his wartime career in late August of 1914, flying as an observer behind his older brother Wilhelm, and by the end of the year they had flown 42 sorties over enemy-held ground together. In 1915, Boelcke assumed pilot duties flying the Fokker E-1 Eindecker monoplane. Now the Eindecker was armed with a Parabellum machine gun that could fire hundreds of bullets from its belted ammunition without reloading, as opposed to the Lewis guns used by the Allies that had to be reloaded after 47 shots. But the use of the Fokkers was restricted. They were to be flown when pilots were not flying reconnaissance missions in their two-seaters. The German General Staff had settled on an aerial strategy of defensive barrier patrols over their own lines. The newly armed planes were considered so revolutionary that they could not be risked over enemy lines for fear of capture. But the General Staff's restriction to defensive patrols was overcome by aggressive insubordination on the part of Boelcke and the other Fokker flyers. Boelcke and Immelmann traded ace of ace distinction at least half a dozen times before Immelmann was killed on the 18th of June in 1916 after his 16th victory. Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered Boelcke grounded for a month to avoid losing him in combat so soon after Immelmann because he was such an important hero to the German public, as well as such an authority on aerial warfare that it could not be risked. Boelcke downed his 19th victim before reporting to headquarters on the 27th of June. During his grounding, he wrote the DICTA Boelcke, arguably the most important document in the history of fighter aviation. The 8 parts of the DICTA Boelcke are as follows. 1. Try to secure advantages before attacking. If possible, keep the sun behind you. 2. Always carry through an attack when you've started it. 3. Fire only at close range and only when your opponent is properly in your sights. 4. Always keep your eye on your opponent and never let yourself be deceived by ruses. 5. In any form of attack, it is essential to assail your enemy from behind. 6. If your opponent dives on you, do not try to evade his onslaught, but fly to meet it. 7. When over the enemy's lines, never forget your own line of retreat. 8. For the squadron, attack on principle in groups of 4 or 6. When the fight breaks up into a series of single combats, take care that several do not go for the same opponent. That is the DICTA Boelcke. On the 10th of August in 1916, Boelcke assumed command of Jasta II. While the squadron struggled to get going, Boelcke flew combat solo sorties. On 2 September, flying a Fokker D-3, he shot down Captain R.E. Wilson for victory number 20. In a show of old world warfighting elegance and protocol, Boelcke hosted Wilson in the squadron mess before returning the British flyer to captivity. On October 28, 1916, Boelcke and 5 of his pilots attacked a pair of British airplanes. As the British airplanes maneuvered to evade the attacking Germans, Boelcke wound up having a midair with his wingman. The slight impact split the fabric on the wing of his Albatross. As the fabric tore away, the wing lost lift and the stricken plane spiraled down, eventually impacting the ground near a German artillery battery. Although the crash seemed survivable, Boelcke was not wearing his crash helmet, nor was his safety belt fastened, and he died of a fractured skull. At the time of his death, he tallied 40 victories. After his death, Jasta II went on to be one of the 2 most successful German fighter squadrons during the remainder of the war, scoring 336 victories and achieving a victory ratio that ran as high as 12-1. 8 of its original members became aces. In all, 25 aces would serve in Jasta II, scoring 90% of the German Air Force's victories. 4 of its members would serve as generals during World War II. The DICTA Boelcke is taught at centers of excellence worldwide, including the U.S. Air Force Fighter Weapons School and the U.S. Navy Fighter Weapons School, also known as Top Gun. At number 3, with a Mooch tally of 35.7, is Eddie Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker first came into the national spotlight as a racing figure, earning the nickname Fast Eddie for his hard driving. One sports writer called him the most daring and the most cautious driver in America today. He drove for Duesenberg, Peugeot, and Maxwell before signing with Sunbeam, a British manufacturer. Before he got to England, Rickenbacker had had 2 chance encounters with aviators. Glenn Martin, who's the founder of the Wright-Martin Aircraft Company, gave Rickenbacker his first ride aloft. Major Townsend F. Dodd was stranded with his plane in the field, and Eddie diagnosed a magneto problem. Dodd later became General John J. Pershing's aviation officer and an important contact in Rickenbacker's growing desire to be a military pilot. Back in the United States, Rickenbacker pitched an idea for a squadron composed of race car drivers and mechanics to a New York Times reporter. Quote, "War would practically put a stop to racing, and we have a training that our country would need in time of war. We are experts in judging speed and in motor knowledge," end quote. After the April 6th declaration of war, Rickenbacker went to Washington to propose his idea. He was ignored. Military officials wanted college-educated men for the new aviation section, not men from the working classes, as were most race car drivers, including Rickenbacker. In late May of 1917, Dodd invited Rickenbacker to be General Pershing's chauffeur. By mid-June, he was, quote, "somewhere in France," end quote, driving Army officials between headquarters and various points on the Western Front. Rickenbacker was given the rank of Sergeant First Class, but he did not drive for General Pershing. He mostly drove for Major Dodd. And eventually, through the right connections, natural talent, and lots of hard work and desire, Rickenbacker became a pursuit pilot. Once in the cockpit, he was mentored by the legendary Major Raoul Lufberry. Lufberry took him on their first patrol over the line even before their Newport 28s were outfitted with machine guns. Rickenbacker was assigned to the 94th Squadron, known as the Hat in the Ring Gang, because of their emblem that depicted an Uncle Sam top hat tipped inside a hoop. On April 29, 1918, Rickenbacker shot down his first enemy plane. Less than a month later, he claimed his 5th victory to become an ace. Rickenbacker was awarded the Croix de Guerre for his 5 victories. His new status didn't keep him from making mistakes, though. Several times he almost fired on friendly planes. He nearly crashed when the fabric on his Newport's wing tore off in a dive. He mourned the death of his mentor Lufberry, who'd been shot down earlier that month, and his guns jammed way too often whenever he went in for the kill. On May 30th, he scored his 6th victory, but it would be his last for 3.5 months. He suffered a fever in late June and developed an ear infection in July, which grounded him. During his hospitalization in Paris, Rickenbacker had plenty of time to reflect on his shortcomings as a flying ace. He decided that he needed to show more self-discipline, less impulsiveness when and if he ever got back into the air. He did get back in the air in time for the Saint-Mihiel offensive beginning on September 12th. By this time, the 94th and other squadrons of the 1st Pursuit had converted from their agile but temperamental Nieuports to the more rugged, high-powered Spad 8s. The new machine fit Rickenbacker's style of attack to a T. He made his first kill on September 14th against a Fokker D7, and another the day after that. But as Rickenbacker's performance was rising, the 94th Squadron was going the other way. Major Harold Hartney, commander of the 1st Pursuit Group, wanted new leadership to spark the Hat in the Ring gang to its former greatness. He chose Lieutenant Rickenbacker over several captains to become the new CO of the 94th. Rickenbacker went right to work turning his men back into a team. He gathered his pilots and told them to stay focused on their mission, which was shooting down enemy planes. He reminded the mechanics that he was one of them, and he stressed the crucial importance of their work. Above all, he would never ask anybody to do anything that he wouldn't do himself or do at the same time. To underscore this point, the morning after he gave that lecture, he took a solo patrol over the line and shot down 2 enemy planes. Those victories in the air above Billy France later earned him the Medal of Honor, which was awarded to him by President Herbert Hoover in 1931. Rickenbacker instilled the squadron with his new principles of engagement, which he first came up with while confined to the Parisian hospital. Never attack unless there's a 50-50 chance of success. Always break off an engagement that seems hopeless. And know the difference between cowardice and common sense. He continued to fly aggressively, but with a calculated caution. That same combination that sports writer had written about when he was a race car driver. But now he was the most daring and the most cautious fighter pilot in the 1st Pursuit Group. He also flew more patrols, had more hours in the air than any other pilot, a total of 300 combat hours. He brought down 15 aircraft in the final 6 weeks of the war, bringing his total victories to 26 and making him the United States ace of aces for the war. When Rickenbacker heard about the armistice, he flew an airplane above no man's land to observe the ceasefire as it occurred on 11 a.m. on November 11th. He later wrote, "I was the only audience for the greatest show ever presented. On both sides of no man's land, the trenches erupted. Brown uniformed men poured out of the American trenches, gray-green uniforms out of the German. From my observer's seat overhead, I watched them throw their helmets in the air, discard their guns, and wave their hands." Like Joe Foss, Eddie Rickenbacker had a wide variety of roles after his military service. He founded the Rickenbacker Auto Company that pioneered the 4-wheel brake system, but ultimately failed because his cars were too expensive as the market increased. He bought the Indianapolis Speedway, improved it, but decided to close it during World War II because he considered races there as a waste of gasoline and rubber. He was the GM of Eastern Airlines and was a passenger in an Eastern DC-3 when it crashed on February 26, 1941. Rickenbacker's injuries included a fractured skull, shattered left elbow with a crushed nerve, paralyzed left hand, several broken ribs, crushed hip socket, severed nerve in his left hip, a broken left knee. His left eyeball was also blown out of its socket. It took many months in the hospital, followed by a long time at home, for Rickenbacker to heal from this multitude of injuries and to regain his full eyesight. In 1942, while touring the Pacific Theater as a representative of the president, he was a passenger in a B-17 that crashed at sea, and he survived 24 days in a raft that included eating a seagull that had landed on his head. And for you guitarists out there, Eddie was a distant cousin of Adolphe Rickenbacker, who co-founded Rickenbacker Guitars, and they chose the Rickenbacker name because of Eddie's popularity. Eddie Rickenbacker died in Zurich, Switzerland from a stroke and associated pneumonia on July 23, 1973. All right, we're down to the top 2. At number 2, with a Mooch tally of 36.3, is Manfred von Richthofen. At the start of World War I, Richthofen served as a cavalry reconnaissance officer on both the Eastern and Western fronts, and he saw action in Russia, France, and Belgium. But with the advent of trench warfare, which made traditional cavalry operations outdated and inefficient, Richthofen's regiment was dismounted, serving as dispatch runners and field telephone operators. He was disappointed and bored at not being able to directly participate in combat, and the last straw for him when he was ordered to transfer to the Army's supply branch. He was quoted as saying, "I have not gone to war in order to collect cheese and eggs, but for another purpose." Finally, his request to transfer to another warfare specialty was granted, and he joined the flying service at the end of May in 1915. From June to August of 1915, Richthofen served as an observer on reconnaissance missions over the Eastern Front. He scored his first confirmed victory in the skies over France on the 17th of September, 1916, flying the Albatross. Afterwards, he contacted a jeweler in Berlin and ordered a silver cup engraved with the date and the type of enemy aircraft and he continued to celebrate each of his victories in the same manner until he had 60 cups. At that point, the dwindling supply of silver in blockaded Germany meant that silver cups could no longer be supplied. Instead of using a lesser metal, he just stopped the practice. Richthofen flew the celebrated Fokker DR-1 triplane from late July 1917, the distinctive three-winged aircraft with which he is most commonly associated. In fact, only 19 of his 80 kills were made using the Fokker triplane, despite the popular link between him and the triplane. Richthofen received the Blue Max in January of 1917 after his 16th confirmed kill, the highest military honor in Germany at the time. That same month he assumed command of Jasta 11, which ultimately included some of Germany's most elite pilots, many who were trained by Oswald Boelcke or who Richthofen trained himself, and several who later became leaders of their own squadrons. Richthofen took the flamboyant step of having his albatross painted red when he became a CO. As a result, other members of the squadron also painted parts of their airplane red to make their leader less conspicuous and to avoid having him singled out in a fight. Richthofen led his new unit to unparalleled success, which peaked in April of 1917, which was known as Bloody April. In that month alone, he shot down 22 British aircraft, including 4 in a single day, which raised his official tally to 52. By June, he had become the commander of the first new, larger fighter wing formation. These were highly mobile, combined tactical units that could move at short notice to different parts of the front as required. Richthofen's new command became widely known as the Flying Circus due to the unit's brightly colored aircraft and its mobility, including the use of tents, trains, and caravans where appropriate. A few months later, Richthofen sustained a serious head wound during an engagement over Belgium, which caused instant disorientation and temporary partial blindness. He regained his vision just in time to ease his aircraft out of a spin and execute a forced landing in a field in friendly territory. The injury required multiple operations to remove bone splinters from the impact area. The Red Baron returned to active service against doctor's orders on 25 July, but went on convalescent leave from 5 September to 23 October. His wound is thought to have caused lasting damage. He later often suffered from post-flight nausea and headaches, as well as mood swings. The Red Baron's final mission ended just after 11 a.m. on the 21st of April in 1918 while flying over Molencourt Ridge near the Somme River. At the time, he'd been pursuing at very low altitude a Sopwith Camel piloted by novice Canadian pilot Lieutenant Wilfred May. May had just fired on the Red Baron's cousin, Lieutenant Wolfram von Richthofen. On seeing his cousin being attacked, the Red Baron flew to his rescue and fired on May, causing him to pull away. Richthofen pursued May across the Somme, and he was spotted and briefly attacked by another Camel piloted by a Canadian captain named Arthur Roy Brown. Brown had to dive steeply at very high speed to intervene, and then he had to climb steeply to avoid hitting the ground. Richthofen turned to avoid this attack, and then he resumed his pursuit of May. During that turn, he was killed by a bullet through the chest. His aircraft stalled and went into a steep dive, hitting the ground just north of the village of Vaux-sur-Somme, in a sector defended by the Australian Imperial Force. The aircraft bounced heavily upon hitting the ground, the undercarriage collapsed, and the fuel tank was smashed before the aircraft skidded to a stop. Several witnesses reached the crashed plane and found the Red Baron already dead. Number 3 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps was the nearest Allied air unit, and they assumed responsibility for Richthofen's remains. His Fokker triplane was soon taken apart by souvenir hunters. The Australian squadron's commanding officer organized a full military funeral. Richthofen's body was buried in the cemetery at the village of Bertonglay on the 22nd of April in 1918. Squadron officers served as the pallbearers, and a guard of honor from the squadron's other ranks fired a salute. Other squadrons stationed nearby presented memorial wreaths, one of which was inscribed with the words, "To our gallant and worthy foe." In the early 20s, the French authorities created a military cemetery at Fricourt, in which a large number of German war dead, including Richthofen, were reinterred. In 1927, von Richthofen's youngest brother Boelcke recovered the body from Fricourt and took it to Germany. Richthofen's body received a state funeral. Later, the Third Reich held a further grandiose memorial ceremony at the site of the grave, erecting a massive new tombstone engraved with a single word, Richthofen. During the Cold War, the cemetery was on the boundary of the Soviet Union in Berlin. The tombstone was damaged by bullets fired at attempted escapees from East Germany. In 1975, the body was moved to a family plot in Wiesbaden. As I mentioned before, the Red Baron was ultimately credited with 80 victories, and his status as an icon was cemented in pop culture worldwide by modelers and the cartoonist Charles Schulz, who frequently drew one of his characters, Snoopy, on top of his doghouse role-playing as the Red Baron. All right, at number 1, drum roll please. With a mooch tally of 38.5 is Erich Hartmann. In October 1942, Hartmann was assigned to a Messerschmitt squadron on the Eastern Front, but he and several other pilots were initially given the task of ferrying Stukas. His first flight ended with a brake failure, which caused the Stuka he was flying to crash into and destroy a hut near the runway. But in spite of that dubious start, his natural talent was quickly recognized by his superiors and mentors. Hartmann, nicknamed Booby, which is German for the kid, became a master of stalk and ambush tactics, preferring to ambush and fire at close range rather than dogfight. His preferred method of attack was to hold fire until extremely close, then unleash a short burst at point-blank range, a technique he learned while flying as a wingman of his former commander Walter Krupinski, who favored this approach. This technique, as opposed to long-range shooting, allowed him to reveal his position only at the very last moment, compensate for the low muzzle velocity of some models of the Messerschmitt, hit the target without wasting any ammunition, prevent the adversary from taking evasive action. Hartmann's guidance amplified the need to detect while remaining undetected. His approach was described by his motto: see, decide, attack, reverse. Observe the enemy, decide how to proceed with the attack, make the attack, and then disengage to reevaluate the situation. Hartmann's instinct was to select an easy target or withdraw and seek a more favorable situation. Once the attack was over, the rule was to vacate the area. Survival was paramount. Another attack could be executed if the pilot could re-enter the combat zone with the advantage. On the 29th of October 1943, Hartmann was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for 148 enemy aircraft destroyed, and the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross for 202 enemy aircraft on 2 March 1944. Exactly 4 months later, he received the Swords to the Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves for 268 enemy aircraft shot down. Ultimately, Hartmann earned the coveted Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with Oak Leaves, Swords, and Diamonds on the 25th of August, 1944 for 301 aerial victories. Hartmann achieved his 352nd and last aerial victory at midday on the 8th of May, 1945, hours before the German surrender. Along with the remainder of his squadron, he surrendered to the United States Army forces, but they turned him over to the Red Army. In an attempt to pressure him into service with the Soviet-friendly East German National People's Army, he was tried on war crimes and convicted. He was initially sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment, later increased to 25 years, and spent 10 years in various Soviet prison camps and gulags until he was released in 1955. When Hartmann returned to West Germany, he re-entered military service and became an officer in the West German Air Force. After that, Hartmann made several trips to the United States, and in 1957 he began training with American instructors at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. I cannot imagine trying to be a flight instructor to Erich Hartmann. That would sort of be like trying to give golf swing tips to Tiger Woods. At this time, the German Air Force was trying to procure the F-104 Starfighter. Hartmann considered the Starfighter a fundamentally flawed and unsafe aircraft and strongly opposed its adoption by the German Air Force. And although events subsequently validated his low opinion of the Starfighter, 269 crashes and 116 German pilots killed on the F-104 in non-combat missions, Hartmann's outspoken criticism proved unpopular with the chain of command, and he was put into early retirement in 1970. Hartmann died in Germany on the 20th of September in 1993 at the age of 71. In 1997, the Russian Federation posthumously relieved him of all charges they'd brought against him after the war. And in 2016, Hartmann's former unit honored him by applying his signature tulip color scheme to their current aircraft, which was the Eurofighter. And those are the all-time top 10 aces of aces. You can see common threads regardless of era. These are men of honor, character, who led by example, who respected the profession and their enemies. The lessons they came up with are timeless and apply to air combat even in a fifth-generation environment today. All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're a first-time viewer, please ring the bell and become a subscriber. Give me the likes and comment. Let me know if you agree with my list or if yours would be different. Show your work. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/WardCarroll. Check the links below for merch, including where to get the Punk's Trilogy, my first 3 novels about life in a Tomcat squadron. When you check out, if you're using us9.org, use the discount code PUNKYT for 25% off. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again soon.